Hey everyone, I'm Caroline Hill. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Legal IT Insider. Welcome to Charting Change in Legal. I'm here with Ari Kaplan. Hi, Ari.
Hi, Caroline. Great to speak with you. Hi, everyone. I'm Ari Kaplan. I'm an analyst that covers legal, and I am excited this week to talk about something we have not talked about, like artificial intelligence or chat GPT or actually those issues have evolved. So anything interesting that you're hearing this week, Caroline?
Well, do you know what? Actually, what's almost the opposite. Okay, so we obviously we talked a little bit about GPT after Legal Week immediately after, and there was nothing but talk about GPT. I feel like things within legal, I don't know. Okay, fine, that's a lie. But there's not been as so many vendor announcements. There's been like a slight reprieve, although in conversations like this, everybody's still talking about it. But I do think that people have been reflecting. I've had some really fascinating conversations with law firm legal tech heads. So there's one who, when you speak to somebody, it's real food for thought. Like, I had a moment to pause and just, get off the GPT roller coaster. And he said to me, yes, it's really interesting. But aside from any of the client data concerns, he said, if you have, and he was sort of directing this at vendors a little bit. If you have a solution, actually vendors and law firms, if you have a solution that works really well, like machine translation, and it does what it needs to do, and it doesn't really need to be improved, and it's been worked on for some time, and you kind of refined it. It doesn't need GPT. He goes and he goes, he said, it's expensive and it's bad for the planet. And I know that you and I sort of thought about this before. Ari's laughing at me because we were like, why is it expensive? But anyway, so but obviously it's because of the huge amount of server power it takes, right? Huge amount of data center, and so it was real food for thought for me, I have to say, to kind of get off the GPT roller coaster or get on in a different way. I don't know if any of that resonates with you.
Well, I think because of where we are in the year, mid-April, and the structure of how firms have treated a return to the office, you're starting to see much more thoughtful conversation. So in my conversations with law firm leaders, this was the turning point, right? The watershed moment for going back to the office a little bit more formally, not full time. I don't want anyone to get super nervous, but a few days a week where most people are in the office has happened now. It started in the early part of the year. That's when the whole GPT conversation happened. People went wild. They couldn't believe it. They started creating poems in the voice of whatever, right? All kinds of strange experiments. And then they started seeing each other. So the work started getting done, but then there was this moment, I think, back to this kind of idea of having a water cooler conversation, and people would start to say, hey, did you see whatever? What will we do with that? And I think the more thoughtful conversations started there, were sparked in that way. Then once you have the foundation, you could kind of go back to Zoom and have a quick 30-minute. I think that the conversations that have time settings where you have a 30-minute Zoom meeting and then it's sort of just leave meeting, you can't do that in person. And I think that the starter happened to be a result of many different things, but I think you're right. I think definitely people are being more thoughtful about the practical approach. And we saw this happen in so many different ways over the years. With e-discovery, it's happened where it was like, oh, we can do all these wild things. Let's think about how we actually apply it to a problem. And you're starting to see that here, which is super interesting because I think practical innovation is what most organizations are striving for.
Yeah, I do think that. The other really interesting thing that this person said, which I haven't really heard talked about elsewhere, is about that firms appear to have been taken by surprise, in the last few weeks. And he said there were three things that I think really resonated. The second one was he said that firms that have been taken surprise by this really aren't doing their job in terms of staying on top of what the likes of Microsoft are doing. He said this was no surprise, or shouldn't have been any surprise to anyone. He said Microsoft has been talking about generative AI for years, and anybody who's been really tracking that in the way that they should would really have, this should be no surprise. And he used the example of transcripts and all of this kind of stuff that has already, even predicting, what you're going to say next. He said, this stuff has been trailed for a really long time. This is an evolution, not revolution. And he said, and that was very interesting, because a lot of law firms, unless they're really big, don't, in many cases still, I think, I don't want to be disrespectful to IT teams, but I don't know whether I'd be interested. I need to look into this more as to how many have that specific function. Somebody who is in charge of really going, right, this is what Microsoft's doing. What does this mean for us? And from a real analytical perspective.
Yeah, I think it's unfair. I find myself always being sort of this defender of law firms, but I'm just trying to be a right. But what I'm trying to do is to be fair, in the sense of, I ask, so I did a report several years ago about financial intelligence and how that gives law firms a competitive advantage, especially as we were coming out of the deepest part of the pandemic and law firms struggling to balance what they had going on. And I just finished one that'll come out for the Association of Legal Administrators conference next month, talking to COOs. And both times I asked the question about how much of your time, of your day, of your schedule is dedicated to strategy and innovation, because that's kind of what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about leaders taking a moment, a deep breath, sitting at their desk and sort of pondering the future. And they generally have a very limited opportunity to do that. They desperately want to. And you see a lot of firms. There's a sort of an incredible community that we're both kind of sort of a part of, I guess. Of this knowledge management community, the kind of the folks in legal who are really driving change, whether at the highest leadership level or dispersed throughout the firm. But I think it's unfair. Yes. Were people caught off guard about? Yes, but I think that's been true universally. Right, schools have been caught off guard, and regular non-legal businesses have been caught off guard. It happened very quickly, and it was super interesting. And it's not like when e-discovery first came out, my kids approached me and said, "Hey, Dad, have you seen this predictive coding?" But both of my children texted me about Chat GPT, both teenage, and I just think that's what's happened, right? Your parents and your neighbors are asking you about this. That wasn't happening with, the evolution of document management. Not that those things weren't important, but this is a much more universal trend. And and Microsoft has been busy doing this for a long time. Microsoft bought Nuance and all these other companies, Microsoft and Google and all these other companies have been doing this for a long time. I think that standard is a very hard one to meet. But yes, now that they've been later, they need to be mindful of it. I think they are. And I think I'll just say one last thing, that in my eDiscovery Unfiltered research, I interview a basket of law firm leaders and corporate leaders at the beginning of every year for this research. And because of the way that Legal Week fell out, I did a bunch of interviews right before and a bunch of interviews after. But the interviews that I did before, let's say in February, didn't mention AI and ChatGPT as much as the interviews I did in early April. That was the one trend that everybody talked about. Whereas in the beginning of the year, there were concerns about the economy. There were thoughts about, streamlining a certain software or migrating still to the cloud, right? All of a sudden, though, the ChatGPT conversation. So I think it did happen fast. So while it seems like people were caught off guard, I think we're still in a very, very early part of that cycle.
That's a really good point I'm about to post an article from the Skills, which is a write-up of Skills. So I asked Lucy Dillon, who's on the planning committee from Skills, to pull out some of the highlights, particularly of the sort of closed conference that happened in New York, which I'm just about to post. And she summarized some of there's obviously the in-person forum, and then there's the earlier online one. And what was fascinating about that was that in the in-person one, GPT featured really highly. And in the online one, where the agenda is set just a little bit before, GPT didn't feature at all, right? Which is fascinating. I mean, if you can only so people weren't talking about it. I mean, you're right. It's a fair point.
And I want to put a plug out for skills.law. Just like a great community event and a wonderful contribution to exactly the conversation that we are having, where they offer free content, incredible networking. It's just a wonderful thing that Ozben Amram and Lucy and the entire team are doing there. And and I know that it was sponsored this year by LexFusion, right? So I think it's great that this has been something that the community has at no cost, and is a real benefit that people should
It's
take
one of
advantage
my
of.
favorite conferences,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
online one, they're already taking canvassing ideas for next year, so in terms of content and all that kind of stuff. So it's really worth getting in touch with those, or Lucy Dillon or Ron Friedman to get involved. I agree with you, it's absolutely brilliant. But yeah, no, so it's fascinating. I mean, I like it. You always, you sort of you create a good sort of point about that. I think perhaps that is a bit harsh. But then on the more positive side, the last observation that I thought was really interesting was he was saying about, what does this mean, and from an exciting point of view, internally for law firms, in terms of the way that they could, obviously there's all sorts of things that they could do for drafting or whatever. But he said, what does it mean internally for bringing the firm closer together, for finding out, if you're a big firm, finding out information about what's going on in other offices, or from an enterprise search point of view, being able to search across the firm for for I don't know, the example he gave was, what are they having in London for lunch? I mean, that's a ridiculous example, but just like that, across bringing the internal implications of the way you could potentially leverage it. I don't know. It was a really fascinating conversation, and slightly different from, obviously, the client data piece. I think is still very much an ongoing conversation, and actually I had an email from a solicitor not so long ago saying, oh, how do I get my hands on Harvey, could you connect me? And I'm like, well, it's probably something to be done at a firm-wide level, but and then I connected him with a couple of vendors who were doing something in the space, and they said, oh, actually, we're already working with you at a high level with your firm. And I think firms need to be the excitement that you've already talked about, which is fantastic. It's just fantastic that people are so excited about it. But obviously, they really need clear guidance to lawyers, about this. You can and you can't do this. And I'm still not necessarily 100% seeing that happening.
Well, and then this is, I mean, one of the other things that we have seen over the last few weeks is that firms are starting to announce layoffs. They are streamlining their operations. And, maybe nobody wants to hear this at that moment of when a door closes, a window opens, or whatever. I've certainly had many conversations with folks who are in transition, and sometimes it's meant to be a very practical conversation where they want to, tap my network, which I'm happy to extend, or an introduction or something like that. And sometimes they just want to vent, and it's an emotional experience. And depending on what stage they catch me, I'm happy to listen or happy to provide some guidance. But the one thing that seems to be happening is that at this moment where there's a contraction, there's all of a sudden this incredibly exciting pivotal moment where, if you're really good at understanding how this works and how it can be applied, and frankly, just a little bit more than most people, you could really gain a huge competitive advantage in your job search. It's certainly a question that people will have, and I certainly would love to spend more time talking about it and learning about it and just being a student of where it can be applied. I definitely don't want to be just pushing something I'm not really familiar with, because I think that doesn't do our community any good, just saying, oh, or predicting the destruction of everything without really understanding why. Because this came up yesterday on the virtual lunch. So our sponsor this month, this is a company called TrustPoint One, and we had some of their leaders on, and we were having this amazing I don't record the Tuesday conversations, unfortunately. We'll have another one on Friday, which I do record, but we had this great conversation about how cyber criminals and hackers are leveraging Chat GPT in a way that makes it a cybersecurity concern.
Yeah.
And that was really interesting. It was super practical. They were talking about using ChatGPT to draft something, to draft it quickly, to deploy it in a way that is nefarious. It was super interesting, and it was very practical. And you could tell that, and we ended up having very granular conversations about what's covered in a cyber insurance policy. And that conversation is an important one for firms to have, and is something you can have right now, and is something that the carriers are having. The other stuff about the transformation of the profession, we every year seem to have a conversation about the transformation of the profession, and every few years it occurs, something transforms. But I think that in the day to day, it's hard to have a focus just on that.
With this cyber, that's a really interesting point, because obviously with the phishing attacks, they've become so much more sophisticated, right? Like, so when they draft you that email saying, "Hey Caroline, I've read all of your blogs about, and you're an amazing writer," and I'll be like, "Oh my God, this is so me. I am amazing, and I did write that, right?" Like, and then so I go, and they go, "And would you like to click on this link by this equally esteemed writer," right? Do you know what I mean? You could see, so it would take them potentially a really long time to do that at volume with flattering everybody. But actually,
and then you're like, Ari Kaplan Advisors, that's a ridiculous website. Why would I possibly click on that button? No, spam.
That's really terrifying, because they could use it to draft a credible something or other, right?
Note
Like, they
to
could use
staff:
it as
do
a
not
patent.
send emails to Caroline Hill about how great you are by complimenting her. She doesn't respond well.
I'm just going to assume it's a phishing attack. I mean, like, anyway, but we should probably move on from GPT. You mentioned earlier about going back to work in the water cooler. I think it's really interesting. Like, there's obviously, but it's been a gradual transition, hasn't it? But I know that you actually flagged to me the conversation about the Paul Hastings letter. So I don't know if you want to kick that off, because it's fascinating.
So I want to stay as neutral as I can on this issue, but for everyone's reference, just in case you haven't seen it, there was what seems like a mid-level senior associate at a law firm. We don't need to go into detail because I don't think it's that important, and probably a male. It seemed from the tone. Everyone's trying to like deconstruct this thing, but put kind of non-negotiables about being a junior. It seems like everyone's kind of interpreting this, a junior associate at this firm. And there were a lot of kind of cringy things on there. And I'm sure that anybody would agree that things like you're available 20 or you're online 24/7 or something, and that there are all these other things on this PowerPoint slide that have created lots of discussion, and they're mostly, the overall theme is sort of big laws, a tough place to work, if I can simplify it, and it shouldn't be as tough. And there's been a lot of criticism of it, and I feel like recently, so this came out about a week ago, and now that people have had time to process it, other people, certainly, people that I know of and whose work I read, have come out with a much more balanced view. And my impression of this whole thing in many ways was just about expectations. What are the expectations of new people getting a job like this? Which to be clear, is an extraordinary accomplishment. Like, if you can get a job at a large law firm, I don't care what country we're talking about, you have done yourself, and it's an incredible accomplishment. Yes, it's super hard. I'm not judging any of those things. It's just such a lucky gift to your career, at least at the initial stage, right? I mean, there are all these other things that happen, but like, let's not kid ourselves. People strive to do their best, their very best, to get this kind of job. So, then what is your expectation? And then what is the expectation that people have of you? And what is the expectation that the clients have of the firm? And what is the expectation the leaders have of the people that run different areas? It seemed to all come down to expectations and this terrible misalignment of those expectations. And it just played out in this unfortunate situation of this slide becoming very, very public. And my hope is that it creates a conversation where everyone recognizes what they expect, and somehow we get closer to an equilibrium of that.
To me, so he said specifically, yes. So you are specifically, so working. He was talking about working from home, and you are online 24/7. And to me, that is the biggest issue about working from home. And I think that I think it's good in one sense that it has brought this out, obviously, in a slightly more controversial way. But I actually think it's true. I think it's a huge issue. I think that people are going to get sick. I think that, because the trouble is, whereas before, I mean, obviously, for firms, big firms, there has always been an element of you are available constantly. There's always been an issue over work-life balance, but I think the thing now, when and a lot of them have obviously had to go back to the office some of the time, right? So it's not like you're just at home the whole time. But I do think that there is this lack of divide now because we work from home, and a lot of people are just really set up for it now. And I think that, and you've always got your phone, and you've got your tablet, and I do think that there's a massive issue over never being off duty. And I think with firms that are global, where you've got the time zone difference, you might have different offices. I know I certainly have this issue where I'm working with doing something with America and Australia. At times no one's available because they're all in bed, but I think it's a massive thing that firms really have to think about. How do they help protect people against that culture of you are always online, to the point where it's much worse than it was before.
Well, yes, I agree, but my impression was not that you're online and waiting for that one email at 3:00 in the morning. And when I practiced, so I was lucky to get a job with a large firm and practiced for nearly 9 years. And there was a time when I was a junior associate, I was sharing an office with someone, and we were, I guess, too loud and complaining that we were still there waiting for some project. I don't remember exactly what it was, and it was very early in my career, and one of the partners walked in and said, listen, you guys have to think of yourselves more like plumbers. Plumbers don't work 24 hours a day, but they're available 24 hours a day. They're kind of on call. And at first we kind of laughed it off. We were like, is this person like, that sounds unreasonable? But I think that the point of this 24/7 was not that you're constantly waiting by the phone, like in those days where the BlackBerry would flash with a red light and you knew you had an email. Because I shut my phone, but I work for myself. I think that the point was there will be times when this isn't a 9 to 9 job or a 9 to 7, whatever it was. I mean, people always joke, oh, I work at a lifestyle firm. They serve bagels on Sunday. There's been this joke. This joke is not new. These are not new lifestyle issues. And I don't think it's any different at any very highly paid job. I'm just guessing, I don't know what it's like to be an accountant or an investment banker or in a high position in consulting, but I'm guessing that they all have moments where there are real challenges. And I think it was just an issue of you're available. But you are right. I think a lot of people had trouble shutting down. We're just sitting at their computer watching Netflix at 11 o'clock at night, sending emails or responding to emails 3:00 in the morning, and they were just like, what on earth? Where is the line anymore? There's no train, there's no train home, there's no change your clothes. Like it just blended. So you're right.
Like I think, I work from home, and you work a lot of the time. I know we travel and we do all this, but I do think that it is harder than ever to put up those barriers. And I do think for firms as well, I'm always astonished by how little visibility they still have, given how long we've been doing this hybrid working or working from home, of really what people are doing other than emails. Like, so we did, I'm not kind of promoting any particular task management solution, but I do think that firms should have a system whereby they really have visibility over what associates are doing. This is a different point. I'm going off on a tangent here, going off on a rant, but unless it's really important, because for some associates they might be have less, and then they're worrying about their promotion opportunities, and and if they are working in a firm, there are lots of firms I know of where they are substantially working from home, and therefore they don't have the visibility that you would do if you're in the office, and they don't know what people are doing. And so some of them may well be working 24/7, and then others might I think that for me is one of the biggest weird things of the post-pandemic, that they just still don't know.
I'll just sum up. I'll sum up our discussion today and just say that all of these things, whether it's the evolution and application of AI and ChatGPT and how people are returning to the office and what the lifestyle in certain kinds of organizations is and should be, is that we are now in this moment of having a real conversation in a lot of different ways about what the profession looks like and what we want it to look like and what it will be forced to handle it looking like because we can't stop the train of technology development. So I think that it's great. I think that we're at a great moment of having a conversation as long as people approach the conversation in an effort to empower and engage as opposed to just be heard and influence, because then it's not a dialogue anymore, and I don't know that it's going to be as productive that it otherwise could be.
Ari, you made it sound like we had a really great chat. Like
We
you
did.
made it sound like
I made it sound like real thoughtful discussion. I just summed it up. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to cut out everything else and just give the last minute, and
no,
that'll be our show today.
that was the best bit of all. Like that was awesome.
Awesome. All right, everyone. It was my privilege to be joined by Caroline Hill. Caroline, I look forward to having our next conversation.
I love that. All right. It's nice chatting with you as always. Until next time.